Hey everybody, welcome to the briefing room here on ABC News Live. I'm Devin Dwyer in Washington. Great to have you with us on this Tuesday. A lot of big developments up on Capitol Hill and at the Supreme Court today. We'll get into all those right now with our political director, Rick Klein. Great to have Rick here today. And we have a lot of guests today to get to as well to talk about some of these headlines. But first, Rick, the one that is sort of the biggest bombshell of the day is the administration's changing position on the Affordable Care Act, a major lawsuit brought by 20 Republican states' attorneys general challenging the law. A federal district court late last year said the entire law was unconstitutional, all of it. And the Trump administration overnight surprised everyone with a one-page letter saying they were going to tell the court they agree. They want it struck down. As it now goes to the appeals court, it's sort of sent shivers down Democrats' spine and a lot of people that rely on the law.
We thought the big news from the Attorney General this week would be the Mueller report or the summary thereof. That you can make a real argument that this decision by the Justice Department to reverse course, change the administration position, ask for the entire Affordable Care Act to be tossed out based on their legal standing, that could have a bigger political impact than anything happening around Robert Mueller. This is a very big deal. It is a statement by the administration that fits with the policy that they have promulgated before, which is that the Affordable Care Act should be repealed. It hasn't been repealed, but now they're saying the court should throw it out anyway based on other pieces have been chipped away. That's a big development. And without
an alternative in place or even teed up on Capitol Hill, that is raising a lot of concern by doctors, patients, groups of both camps out on the front lines of America's healthcare system. And I want to bring in one of those now, Dr. Joanna Bailey. She is a board-certified family physician, cares for patients in both Wyoming and several counties in West Virginia. Doctor, great to see you. Thanks for joining us right now. I want to get your reaction to the developments of the past 24 hours and help us understand what's at stake for people like you and your patients.
I'm worried and I'm concerned for my patients and for our clinic as a whole. We're a federally qualified health center, which means that we receive federal funding and we take care of everybody, whether they are able to pay us or not. And thankfully, when the Affordable Care Act came into being, we had the number of patients that we saw who didn't have insurance fall drastically. And that's mostly been because of the Medicaid expansion, but to an extent, it's also been because of the healthcare exchange, which of course isn't ideal, but it's definitely better than nothing. We have been able to expand programs. Specifically, we've expanded our addiction treatment programs, and it's mostly through Medicaid that those treatment programs are paid for. So I really worry about how this possibility of a complete repeal of that law is going to affect us and our patients.
And voices like yours, Dr. Bailey, are certainly being heard on Capitol Hill just this morning as lawmakers come back into town. Our senior congressional correspondent, Mary Bruce, has been talking to members on both sides of the aisle who are now ramping up efforts to address concerns like yours, particularly about pre-existing condition protections under the current law. Here's a little bit of Mary Bruce's reporting.
What is your message to Americans who may be concerned about their health care?
The Republican Party will soon be known as the party of health care.
What's your plan?
The Department of Justice is sabotaging, literally sabotaging American statutes in the name of an ideological crusade against American health care by this administration. I thought we were beyond the effort to destroy the Affordable Care Act.
The Republicans, because they can't stand the word Obama, are determined to kill the Affordable Care Act, which guarantees to Americans you will not be discriminated against because someone in your family has a pre-existing condition. And now the Justice Department has said we're ready to fight to eliminate the Affordable Care Act regardless. We're back where we were in 2018.
Number one, Obamacare has failed the American people. It doesn't give me joy to say that, but we were promised with the Affordable Care Act that it would do two things. It would lower the cost of health insurance, and it would make it more accessible. It's done neither. We need to get rid of it. We need to replace it with a health insurance system. Looks like somebody designed it on purpose. And that system should provide coverage for pre-existing conditions. I don't think that the American people are asking too much for us to do that.
Democrats here clearly see this new battle over Obamacare as a win for them politically. This is something that they want to be talking about up here. While Republicans, they have long promised to repeal and replace Obamacare. They just now have to come up with a plan to do it.
But Rick, and our thanks to Mary Bruce there, setting aside the politics of this, and there are a lot of politics to unpack, there's some real concern for people out there that there is no alternative and that Congress, which is so divided, couldn't even succeed in repealing Obamacare, can't come to an agreement on pretty much anything of this significance, that there is no alternative in place. If the court were to strike down Obamacare in its entirety, what then? It's sort of this doomsday scenario. And I guess the question to you is, do you think the White House could be onto something here? Are they trying to force both sides to come together? If the courts pull the rug out, maybe they're going to have to do something and fast?
Well, that would force the conversation. They cannot legislatively repeal and replace. They tried that when they had Republican control of the House as well as the Senate. They didn't get it. We remember the votes that didn't go the president's way. He remembers them because he reminds us about John McCain's no vote almost every week. So that means the only way to do it is through the courts if you want to get rid of Obamacare. And yes, it would look different the next day if suddenly the entire Affordable Care Act would be deemed unconstitutional. We're not there yet. A lot of legal hurdles to get there, but that would force a conversation. But I'll tell you, it does not feel to me like this White House has that conversation ready to go. To even see the president's response to Mary Bruce up there, that the Republicans will be known as the party of health care. That's nice. That's not a plan. And even Republican senators pointed that out today, that you can't replace something with nothing.
All right. I want to bring into the conversation Melissa Murray. She's an NYU law professor, someone who once clerked for Justice Sonia Sotomayor. And Professor Murray, I want to ask you about what's next in all of this. I mean, how urgent is this situation, and how likely is it, do you think, that the federal courts, the Supreme Court, will ultimately strike this down?
So this is currently pending before an intermediate appellate court, and they will first have to decide before it can go on to the U.S. Supreme Court. But it definitely seems clear that this is shaping up to be another epic battle over Obamacare that the court will again step in to decide.
So we have some time yet in this legal fight, which probably won't make it until next term in the Supreme Court at the earliest. But want to go back to Dr. Bailey out in the middle of the country. I'm struck, Dr. Bailey, by the fact that you work in two very red states. You've spent some time in Wyoming. You spent some time in West Virginia talking to patients. Those are states that voted overwhelmingly for President Trump, Republicans generally. Do you have a sense from patients that you deal with? Are they comfortable with eliminating Obamacare? Do they understand the stakes? And kind of what's your read on public sentiment in those states?
So I'm actually not from Wyoming, just from Wyoming County in West Virginia. But we are still a very deeply red state, and the southern part of West Virginia went more heavily for Trump than anywhere else in the country. But with that being said, we are very working class strong. I take care of a lot of very hardworking people. I take care of a lot of people who didn't have health insurance before the Affordable Care Act came into place and who do now. And those people realize that. They realize that that law gave them health insurance, and they are going to be very, very unhappy if it goes away. It doesn't matter who does it. These are people who went for years and years who were not able to get the care that they needed, even though they were working very hard and are now getting that care. So people are not going to be happy.
All right, Dr. Joanna Bailey joining us from West Virginia County, West Virginia, or Wyoming County, West Virginia. Thank you so much, Dr. Bailey. Sorry about that. Really appreciate your time and perspective. Thanks for coming on. And Rick, hearing from folks like Dr. Bailey, hearing these personal stories really helped Democrats in the 2018 midterm campaign sort of build that wave in the House of Representatives. What's the impact going to be now that healthcare has been resurgent as a topic of political debate in 2020?
You can argue that the single biggest issue that motivated voters, that drove the turnout that we saw and the results that we saw in 2018 was healthcare. It wasn't Russia. It wasn't Robert Mueller. It wasn't anything else really that the president has said or done. And you could sense that even in the defense that the president was playing about pre-existing conditions, almost all Republicans were saying, we're going to protect your pre-existing conditions. That was their closing message because they knew the Democrats were hitting on something. And let me tell you, for Democrats who really want to turn the page after the Mueller report, they would much rather be talking about issues like healthcare. In fact, healthcare front and center as a number one. than almost anything else. They feel like that is a winning set of issues because they feel like they're on the right side of this, because people are already depending on these services, and that they realize that the Republicans have not offered a true alternative.
And by and large, many Americans of both political persuasions have very favorable opinions of the ACA. I think we have some of those polling numbers out from the Kaiser Family Foundation, a nonpartisan group, sort of the gold standard in healthcare policy in this town. You see here 82% of young adult people are in favor of young adults staying on their parents' plans. All these provisions individually very popular, even as the top line gets it takes a lot of bullets in political rallies and the like. And we should also just note as we end the conversation here how many of you face an impact if the court is to strike down Obamacare. By the latest count, according to the Trump administration, 11.4 million people have coverage just through the Affordable Care Act alone, receiving those subsidized premiums of $612. All of that would be gone in effect if this is struck down. So something that we will certainly be keeping an eye on here on ABC News Live, and much more to come as it works its way through the court system. Meanwhile, speaking of the court system, a lot of developments today on that front. Want to bring in now a guest here, David Chipman, a former ATF agent and now a member of the Giffords Foundation, because today is the day, David, that the Trump administration's ban on bump stocks took effect at midnight, and it is now illegal, even as it's challenged in court, to own or possess or sell a bump stock. Big deal.
Yeah, and it struck home when I saw reports that the major supplier of bump stocks had made the decision to turn over 60,000 bump stocks to ATF in Texas for destruction. So this is real, it's really happening, and in the wake of the worst mass shooting in American history, where bump stocks were used to wound hundreds and kill dozens, this is a day where, it's a somber day, but it's a day that we needed to take to support public safety in America.
It's now a felony to possess a bump stock, subject to 10 years in prison, up to $250,000 fine. The Justice Department told me just a few hours ago that even as it's being contested in court, it is in effect, it is being enforced. I want to talk about that, but also want to bring back into the conversation Professor Melissa Murray from NYU, because even as we delve into what this all means, Melissa, the Supreme Court at this hour is actually grappling with whether or not to put the ban on hold today as these challenges go forward. What is Justice Sotomayor, someone who you used to clerk for, what is she considering right now and weighing whether or not to put it on hold?
So there have been two emergency requests for a stay in enforcing the bump stock ban. And what the justices, it was two justices, Justice Sotomayor and Chief Justice Roberts, who had to weigh in on these emergency stays from the circuits where they're the circuit justices. They basically have to figure out if they should put it on hold or if there's a reasonable way to allow this to proceed through the legal system, if the plaintiffs are going to prevail on the merits or if we should continue going on. It's not a question of the merits. This is not a determination that the bump stock ban is constitutional or unconstitutional. That will come as the litigation progresses through the courts. What this is just a basic determination about whether or not the ban is going to go into effect while the litigation is pending. And Chief Justice Roberts denied that stay request, so it is going to go into force and with regards to the D.C. Circuit. And we are now waiting for Justice Sotomayor's determination on a Sixth Circuit emergency appeal.
And I'm going to put you on the spot because I'm interested, in light of what David just told us, that suppliers are already destroying product that could have been sold for profit. And all Americans who have one are told to destroy it or turn it in. It does seem that there's a real immediate impact. Now, this is in effect. Do you think, what do you think Sotomayor is going to do? Do you think she'll put it on hold to allow people to hold tight while this is adjudicated?
Well, as you say, there are strong interests on both sides, both the American people who may want to see this go into effect, as well as the manufacturers who have plenty of product that may be purged while they wait to find out whether or not this is actually a constitutional order. I'm not sure what my old boss would say, but I think the fact that Chief Justice Roberts has denied that emergency request certainly gives her some cover for doing the same thing. So it seems, at least for Chief Justice Roberts, the equities weigh in favor of the administration and allowing that ban to go into force.
And we should say that the groups that have brought this emergency appeal to the Supreme Court, one of them, Gun Owners Association of America, lays out their argument in a brief to the court. They oppose the ban. They say that it is arbitrary. They say it's a reversal of federal law, which bans machine guns. They say that law does not apply to bump stocks. This is all about the definition. They say it endangers the legality of semi-automatic rifles. And I want to come back to David. David, you used to work at the ATF, which is the agency that writes these regulations. For many years had said bump stock sales were perfectly fine. Now that has changed. This all comes down to the issue of whether a bump stock amounts to a single pull of the trigger or multiple pulls of the trigger.
Yeah, it's a highly technical and complicated definition, and this is what happens when technologies change and outrun the law. I think we have to look back that there was consensus, bipartisan consensus after Las Vegas, that we needed to pass a law to ban these devices that were turning semi-automatic weapons into like machine guns. But the Trump administration said that they didn't want to go to a vote. They wanted to go through this regulatory process. We now see the complications of a legal process going into effect, and we predicted this. This is why we wanted to pass a law. That being said, they are now banned. What's interesting is that this law passed during the time of Prohibition is actually a tax law. And so if you currently have a bump stock and you're traveling in your nice SUV, if you get arrested, the government can seize your SUV as well. It's a 10-year federal felony. It's a very, very serious charge. And so as of yesterday, people were trying to, at the last minute, sell these devices, similar to if you knew crack cocaine was going to be banned tomorrow. Wow. Trying to sell them the day before isn't a very smart legal strategy.
And Rick, I'm struck by the politics of this. Here we have a president who has proclaimed himself the most gun-friendly Republican president in decades, and yet his administration from the White House podium declaring that everyone must turn in a pretty popular in many parts of the country piece of gun equipment.
So I'm imagining
Shocking.
the headline. If what David lays out, imagine if this was the Obama administration or the Hillary Clinton administration saying, we will confiscate your car if we find one of these. We will take this device from you. We will not only grab your gun device, we will take your other property as a result of it. Wow, can you imagine the headlines, the screaming headlines out of the NRA today over that? Look, Trump
Does he pay a price for this?
President Trump has had, I don't think so, but I'll come back to that in a second. I think Trump has had a very complicated and interesting relationship with the gun lobby. He is in some ways the biggest friend they've ever had. They gave record amounts to his campaign, and they've been repaid. He's also chastised lawmakers that they're afraid of the NRA, and he has suggested very strongly that he'd be things like for a universal background check or banning sales to anyone under age 21. He's backed off of those positions. I think on the bump stock, they felt like there was a critical mass, a way to just release some pressure, and a rare area where the president's own ideology does not end up prevailing to even go through this regulatory process. He has said Obama's fault. This is Obama's fault. Maybe that's how he's justifying it in his mind, that the Obama ATF allowed these things and he's coming in and doing this. But there's no denying the overlap between the people who are upset about this and the Trump base. I don't think they have somewhere else to plant that support. I think he's able to point to other things and other Second Amendment victories to keep a very solid base of support. They're not going to vote for Democrats, given where that party is headed. But it is striking that this administration would be responsible and now oversee a policy change of this magnitude.
And David, one of the criticisms that gun owners have of this policy is that it can't be policed, that these are bad guys are always going to get guns, they're always going to get bump stocks if they want them, and that this simply harms good, law-abiding citizens who want to play with their toys. How would you, at ATF, how would you enforce this? How would you go around, and how does that actually work in practice?
Well, in practice, I think the first thing is if you can go on to an online marketplace like Arms List and seeing someone overtly selling it, you'll work that case. So I warn everyone out there, don't sell these because that will raise attention. Sure. I then think there is some sort of an honor system that most Americans do abide by the law. Most Americans will destroy these or turn these into ATF. We've seen what the regulated industry has done, turning over 60,000 of these. There will be some people who believe that this is a law that they don't want to follow, and they place themselves at grave risk because once they are brought into court, the court's going to frown on this. Again, we are hearing this confusion today because the administration over a year ago kicked this issue down this can down the road, hoping that this day would not come. The day has come, and that's where we are today.
And it's now being enforced, we understand. David Chipman, yes. Former ATF agent and with the Giffords organization, great to have you. Thanks for coming in today. Thank you so much. And shifting gears just a little bit to another major legal case today playing out at the Supreme Court, even as they, Rick, weigh whether or not to put in emergency stay on the bump stocks issue, they're also hearing the biggest cases in a generation on the issue of political gerrymandering, the practice of drawing those district boundaries like all different sorts of shapes and sizes to advantage one political group over another. Today, Rick, the justices really grappled with this idea is, can that practice be too political, too silencing of one group over another, and they really seem divided.
They're divided, and they've seen it play out to the benefit of Democrats as well as Republicans at different times at the state court level, the state legislative level. This is a hard process. It's gotten so much easier with computer technology to draw exactly the district like you want to. It has some ridiculous consequences that you can look at and say are patently political, nakedly political, to try to preserve an incumbent or preserve a party advantage, but it's played out in different states. In some ways, you saw the justices saying, well, maybe that's the way it's supposed to be. If you elect a certain legislature, even have a certain
right,
political tilt there.
You can't separate the politics.
You elect
from
the Republicans, they're going to help the Republicans. There's always going to be, and there's a long history. As you know, gerrymandering is a play on Elbridge Gerry, who was an early 19th century governor. I mean, this has been going on literally since the beginning of the Republic. Has the process gotten out of hand? I do think the court has to grapple with that question sooner rather than later. We saw an example in Pennsylvania last year where the state Supreme Court threw out the entire map just 7 or 8 months before the election, kicked everything into chaos. A bunch of incumbents lost their jobs because they didn't have districts anymore. That's not ideal. So I think there's a lot of folks on both sides looking for clarity from the high court.
I was in the courtroom today. They were asking a lot of these questions. Clearly, all the justices on both ends of the bench were frustrated by this practice. There was no love for gerrymandering in that courtroom, but wrestling with these issues. It's interesting, though, what's unique about these two cases today that the court heard is that there were a group of college students from North Carolina who came forward to allege that they were personally harmed, personally hurt by the drawing of districts in their state, gerrymandered districts, which they said actually suppressed their vote, silenced their voice. And one of those voters joins us now, Love Caesar. She's a 20-year-old junior at North Carolina A&T University studying history and political science. Love, great to see you. So help us understand why gerrymandering sort of impacts you personally, and what's the argument you're making?
Hi, so I would basically start off by saying the first election I voted in was in 2016, and every election since then I voted. And I know for a fact, since I registered on A&T's campus, that my vote has not been counted the same amount as it could be counted if our campus weren't gerrymandered. I'm not sure how much has been told to the viewers, but I go to A&T, the largest historically black college in the United States, and our campus has been split into 2 gerrymandered congressional districts. Half of our campus is in District 6 and half the other is in District 13. It's very difficult for students when moving from semester to semester or year to year. If you move over the district line, you are required, if you want to participate in the electoral process, you're required to re-register to vote at your new residential address. And that's just one of the things that students at A&T run into as an obstacle as a result of the gerrymandering.
And given your work on the ground with voter turnout, Love, I understand from your testimony and some of the briefs that you've actually seen or what you've described as a lack of engagement on the campus since they drew the line, cutting it right in half, that a number of students simply became disillusioned and threw their hands up that their voices simply aren't going to matter anymore.
Right. A lot of students feel as if because our vote has been diluted, it's been cracked right down the middle, we feel as though it doesn't really matter whether or not we vote. I'm not saying that this is true. I'm saying that this is how we feel. And, you know, we can't invalidate that, because if a student moves from Barbie Hall in District 13 across the line after the semester to District 6 to go to Haley Hall, you have to re-register. And I can just say that that's a very tedious thing to do, just to have to re-register every year, as well as students not really feeling like it makes sense to be politically or civically engaged when it doesn't seem like our voices matter to the government. It's a big disenfranchisement, and we really do feel as though our voices don't matter. It feels as though the state legislature has done this to us on purpose, thinking that we wouldn't realize it happened, but we did, and we have been fighting this ever since the start of it. Today, we do hope that the Supreme Court will, take our feelings into account, because the partisan racial gerrymandering, whichever, they both suppress our voices, no matter how you put it. So students at A&T really do feel like we need to have a bigger voice, and that really entails outlawing gerrymandering for good.
Very well said. Love Caesar, thank you so much for joining us from North Carolina A&T. And it was a sentiment, Rick, that we've heard echoed by Republicans. We saw former Republican California Governor Arnold Schwarzenegger today out on the steps of the Supreme Court making that argument, and Democrats. And that's another thing that makes this case unique. We will see if the court responds to it. But two cases today, one involving Republican gerrymandering, the other Democratic gerrymandering, making very clear that this isn't a partisan issue. This is a problem that both parties acknowledge.
Yeah. And look, at one level, you can see the justice saying, look, if everyone's doing it, maybe that's the way it's supposed to be done. But it has taken on a level of extremity. And sometimes it's redistricting in the middle of the census year when a new party takes over, or it is the extreme thing where you draw those lines and you make the ridiculous shapes and it just becomes so obvious. There is a know it when you see it quality that I think the justices are going to be asked to sort out, because there is a way to do it now with computer software to be very clinical about it. In fact, California is one of the states that's enacted this, where it's done with a nonpartisan commission. There are other ways to do it and take it out of the political realm that don't necessarily mean the court stepping in.
And there was a lot of talk about that today at court. And go back again to our professor at NYU, Melissa Murray, who worked for Justice Sotomayor. Melissa, she was one of the most outspoken today, saying this practice has got to end. It's got to be reined in. And yet you heard Chief Justice John Roberts talk today about the difficulty in setting a rule for that. He sort of openly questioned, how does one judge when political is too political? Is it your sense that's sort of the biggest nut in this case?
Well, that's perennially been the problem in these partisan gerrymandering cases. The court has dealt with gerrymandering over the long term, mostly in the context of racial gerrymandering, but not so much in partisan gerrymandering, because it's been so difficult to divine a workable solution that judges could apply. There was a case just last term, Gill versus Whitford, where the court remanded it back to the lower court because of a jurisdictional issue, but many speculated that the court actually punted because they weren't in a position to actually identify a workable standard that federal courts could actually use for determining when partisan gerrymandering had become too partisan.
And we will see if they decide this time around to come up with a standard. But Melissa Murray, thank you so much for joining us from NYU. Rick, we should button all of this up by saying the stakes are incredibly high, because there's going to be a nationwide redistricting effort coming up very soon after the 2020 census, which will set the maps for a decade to come.
That's right. And everyone wants to get it right the first time. We've seen it become a growing mess decade after decade. And I think with the rise of computer technology and other kind of partisan schemes, it's gotten easier to pull this off. And I am curious if this is when it finally gets settled as a matter from the Supreme Court.
We will know in June. Rick Klein, our political director, thanks so much for being here, Rick. And thank you for watching us here in the briefing room on this very busy Tuesday. I'm Devin Dwyer in Washington. Download the ABC News app for the latest on these and all the stories we're covering today here at ABC News Live. And join us back here 3:30 Eastern Time in the briefing room tomorrow. Hope to see you then.